Welcome to This American Prospect podcast. I'm Senior Editor Gabrielle Gurley. I'm joined by Leah Rothstein, a co-author of Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. It's a book she wrote with her father, Richard Rothstein, a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C., and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Their work is a sequel to his bestseller, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Just Action describes how local residents and advocates can begin to address housing segregation in America. Leah's expertise in housing policy stems from more than 2 decades of experience as a consultant to affordable housing developers and local governments, as well as a community and union organizer. Thank you for joining us here today, Leah.
Thank you.
Housing shortages and affordability challenges for African Americans are intrinsically linked to the strength and success of how a community responds to them, and it fuels a local community's economic prospects. How can residents and housing advocates begin to undo housing segregation that community leaders see persisting but often ignore?
Yeah, well, our entire book of Just Action is filled with dozens of policies and strategies that a local group could take on, advocate for on the local level, that can begin to address segregation, both to stop continuing to perpetuate and maintain segregated communities, and also to redress the consequences of segregation, to remedy the harms that segregation has caused. And the issue of housing unaffordability obviously is an issue all across the country. All communities are grappling with this. It's an economic issue, and it's one that affects African Americans uniquely. And there's reasons for that. There are actions that the government, unconstitutional actions that the government has taken in the past to keep African Americans out of home ownership, to keep African Americans out of white communities. And those actions have consequences today that mean that the unaffordability of housing hits African Americans particularly hard. So if you think about a community that was initially, subsidized by the federal government, usually a suburban community subsidized by the federal government to be built, and then white homeowners subsidized to buy the homes in those communities, those homes were affordable when white families purchased them. They're now not affordable to working class families of any race. But those white families gained wealth in the appreciation of those homes over generations that they can now have been able to pass down to their children and grandchildren to buy homes in those same suburban communities. Now, those suburban communities can no longer explicitly prohibit African Americans from buying into them. But because African American families were kept out of home ownership when home ownership was affordable and subsidized by the federal government, they now lack that intergenerational wealth to be able to buy into those communities. So addressing housing unaffordability is important across the board, but it takes specific remedies to address housing access for African Americans. And what we argue for is that the race-specific crimes of our government require race-specific remedies. So those remedies include subsidies for African Americans to buy into home ownership, preferences for homes that are built in these communities. We need race-specific remedies in order to address these issues and to equalize the playing field and desegregate our communities.
My question following up from that is, forming cross-racial coalitions is difficult. You point to examples in Chicago where map twins, as you call them, neighbors in different parts of the city were able to come together. Neighbors in predominantly Black sections and white sections were able to come together and share their experiences, pastoral dialogues in North Carolina, and an interesting trip to a civil rights museum in Alabama by a white group with a few Black members, again, another Illinois group. All of these are very intentional projects. How do you move from intentional, individually fueled situations where you have a small and committed groups to larger projects that encompass entire communities. And I'm thinking particularly today, where in some communities, schools and libraries are under assault just for taking the reins and trying to share history and experiences to bridge some of these gaps.
Yeah, well, what we argue for in Just Action is that in order to redress segregation nationally, we need to start addressing it locally in our own communities. We understand that we need federal policy change to enact the massive policy interventions and investments needed to address segregation nationwide, but we don't have the political will on the federal level to do that right now. But we can build that political will locally with local groups in our own communities. And it might not be easy. Organizing is rarely easy or quick. It's slow, methodical work. And so we do understand that to affect local change, we need to start building biracial, multi-ethnic groups, committees in our communities willing to take on these issues. They have to be biracial. We need leadership from African Americans and whites in order to accomplish this. And we also understand that that can be daunting because we live in segregated communities, so we have very little social contact with people of other races outside of the workplace. So that's why we give some examples, the ones you mentioned in Chicago, Winston-Salem, another suburb of Chicago. These are examples of groups that have taken some intentional effort to bring people from other races together who live in the same city, but didn't know each other, didn't know people of other races, didn't know about other race neighborhoods in their city. And it took a little bit of intentional effort. In one, it was the Map Twins. It was actually an art project that was started by Tanika Johnson, a photographer in Chicago. In Winston-Salem, it was church groups that came together. So with that intentional effort, these groups have built social relationships and social capital and learned that they have a lot in common, even though their neighborhoods look very different. And from that, we can build a group that can then educate other residents in their neighborhoods and start to advocate for change. But that's what we need to start by building those relationships across races.
When you look across the arc of your own career in this field, I'm wondering what is the most striking or pervasive example of housing segregation that you've confronted in your work, and was it successfully addressed? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the issue that comes up the most often, both in my own work and in talking to people around the country about this book, is the fear, sometimes rightfully so, a fear of the opposition to building more housing in a community, whether it's affordable housing or multifamily housing, diversifying the housing type to hopefully diversify a community. We call these opposition people who oppose this, often we call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard.
Sure.
Because usually they're people who say that in general, they support affordable housing until you propose to build an affordable housing development in their neighborhood, and then they vehemently oppose it. And, NIMBY opposition has been very effective in stopping affordable housing and stopping building more diverse housing in suburban communities, because NIMBYs are very loud, they're vehement in their opposition. They use, thinly veiled racial fear-mongering language about changing community character or increasing crime when they're talking about bringing in lower income people to their neighborhoods. And so they really build on people's fear of neighborhood change. And across the country, people who are interested in these issues in their own community are afraid of, what do we do when we confront this opposition? And what we've been talking to people about around the country since our book has come out is, just as there are people who oppose these changes in your community, there are also people who support it, and they just haven't been organized yet, and they haven't been as loud as the opposers have been. And there's no reason why we can't also show up to planning commission meetings and city council meetings and support these changes just the way that NIMBYs have opposed them. And if I can give an example of a community that I wrote about in a Substack column we have that we've been doing since our book came out, because these examples keep coming up. This is a community in Silicon Valley, very
Mm,
exclusive, expensive community. Um, Median home prices are over $2 million. It's not a place where much affordable housing exists. But a group there started learning about the history of their community, what has led them to this housing affordability crisis, what has made their community look the way it does. It's pretty mostly white. It's very few African Americans who live there. They read The Color of Law, and there's some information in there about this region of California and how it came to be segregated. And so they took that and did some more research and developed a workshop about their own city and how it came to be segregated, the government policies that created the segregation, the institutions behind it,
mhm,
created a timeline and a workshop, a training about this that they did all over their community, and began to build an understanding of from the people who attended their training that their community looked the way they did, not look the way it does, not by accident or, just because they're more deserving to live in that community, but it was intentionally created to keep African Americans and others out, and to allow whites in when it was affordable, and then to allow those home values to appreciate so much that now it's sort of inaccessible to anybody.
mhm,
And they developed an understanding about that history and a shared values of wanting a community that was more inclusive and more diverse. So then they're building this organization, and then the school district proposes to build 90 units of affordable housing for teachers in the city on a vacant site that it owned, because 30% of teachers left their jobs every year in this district
mhm,
because they couldn't afford to live anywhere near their work. And they wanted to address this. So they proposed 90 units of teacher housing. Some neighbors opposed it. They put a measure on the ballot that would make not only this development impossible, but any future rezoning to allow for more multifamily housing would have to go before the voters. So make it
mhm.
virtually impossible, very difficult to build more affordable housing. So this group was already, activated and understood that this ballot measure was another in a series of policies that had created and maintained the segregation of their community. So they launched a campaign to defeat the ballot measure. They went door to door every weekend, talked to their neighbors. And I talked to the leaders of this campaign, and they told me that they would stand in front of a house and think, this person isn't going to support our side. And they would go and talk to them anyway. And more often than not, they did support them because they understood that the exclusivity of their neighborhood was their city was hurting them. Their
Mm.
teachers couldn't live there, their kids couldn't move back home. They wanted a different kind of community. And so they ended up defeating the ballot measure. And so the teacher housing will be built, and now they have an even broader base of support. And so I like to use this example because if it can happen in Silicon Valley, it can happen anywhere where we can
Mhm.
find supporters of affordable housing and of inclusion. It just takes that effort and the work to find them and talk to them.
Well, I want to take that terminology, affordable housing. You yourself mentioned, and you and your father mentioned in the book that it's a troublesome term. And when you look through the housing lexicon, workforce housing, quote unquote, hasn't caught on, but you're beginning to see more discussion of what's called the missing middle. Is that in part? Is that terminology a way to sway some of the NIMBY cohort from their ferocious opposition to some of these, that in their uh, desire to keep out the an element, which you can define however, different communities have different perceptions of what the element is, but they're also keeping out, as you mentioned, teachers, uh, emergency responders, and that sort of thing. Do we need to change our terminology to help convey what communities are lacking?
I think we do, or at least we need to be more clear about what we mean. So you're right that the term affordable housing has come to mean something very specific, which is housing for the very poor, the lowest income amongst us. And we use that term, housing policy folks use it, housing developers use it, government uses it to refer to housing for the poorest amongst us. But the fact of the matter is that housing isn't affordable to most people, not
Yes.
just the poorest,
Mm,
right?
mm,
So,
mm,
affordable housing, if we're talking about it in terms of what the word means, it encompasses a lot more than just the poorest people.
mhm,
We also point out that it's a misnomer or a misunderstanding, mischaracterization that often people assume, affordable housing for poor people means housing for African Americans, that poor and Black are the same thing.
mhm,
And it's just not true. Most Blacks, most African Americans are not poor. They're middle income, they're working families, and housing isn't affordable for them either. Across the country, market rate housing is unaffordable to middle income households.
mhm.
And the quote unquote affordable housing for subsidized housing for poor people, middle income households make too much to qualify for that. So that's why this group is called the missing middle.
Mhm.
And I do think talking about that can address some of the NIMBY opposition. Like in this example I gave about Silicon Valley, the people that they were concerned about when they were talking with their neighbors, what their neighbors were concerned about were that teachers couldn't live in their community, that their kids couldn't move home, that the people who worked in their, favorite stores and cafes couldn't afford to live there. Those aren't the poorest people.
Mhm.
Those are middle income working people who couldn't afford to live in their community because the market rate housing was so out of reach of middle income families.
Mhm.
And so when we talk about affordable housing, we intend to mean the full range of what is affordable to all the full range of income levels. And so when we're talking about building housing that's affordable to African American families in exclusive, predominantly white communities, for desegregating those communities, it includes not only housing for low income people, but also middle income housing. So that missing middle housing. And we go a step further and advocate that we should be building mixed income housing developments so that we have a chance and developments where people of all income levels learn to live together and know each other and come to understand that we're not all that different. But it takes building housing that has those low income units, missing middle units, and market rate units together.
Oh, I just want to mention that here in the District, Maryland and Virginia, the DMV, as this region is called, Arlington, Virginia, which is a well-to-do suburb of Washington, has recently enacted zoning that will permit missing middle constructions, which amazed even the proponents of this construction that they were able to get it through.
Yeah, I
So
understand it was a hard fight.
yes, it was. It
Mhm.
went on for some time, but they were able to do it, and a lot of it, the housing will focus on what they're calling duplexes, up to sixplexes, um, that can go on lots that were formerly reserved for single family homes. So that is encouraging. Like Silicon Valley, the Northern Virginia suburbs are quite expensive and are pricing out the very people that you described. One of the things I want to take up, because this is a new form of housing, is potentially uh, downtown office to residential conversions. You're hearing a lot of talk, particularly in the big cities that have had the workers uh, are now working from home, and you've got uh, hundreds, thousands of square feet of empty office space. And I'm wondering if you've been thinking how community members can prevent these potentially new developments from becoming the province of uh, wealthy whites, empty nesters, or college students and others, rather than having, as you mentioned, a more mixed income population moving into these new opportunities in downtowns.
Yeah, this does uh, present an opportunity, all of these empty buildings that could be turned into housing. And just like any new housing, local government has some control over how it's done through their zoning and planning departments. There's a policy, inclusionary zoning, that many communities have that's adopted through a zoning code that requires that when new market rate housing is built, that a certain percentage of those units have to be sold or rented at affordable prices to lower and moderate income households. So that's a
Mhm.
way that a local government could have influence over how these conversions are happening.
Mhm.
And I think, it'll be different in every community, but doing what it often involves doing an economic study of what's economically feasible to require a developer to do to make the project, profitable for them, so they will do the conversion, but also provide some benefit to the community. And this is what, zoning codes do all the time in determining how big a building can be, how high it can be, how far it's set back from the street. So a local government can use its powers to do the same thing for these conversions, to require some affordability, to require mixed income housing, to provide some funding. So one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of truly mixed income housing developments is because there are subsidies for the lowest income units, and then market rate units are profitable on their own, but there are a few subsidies for the missing middle
Mhm.
housing. But
Mhm.
a local government, and we provide some examples in Just Action of local funding sources that provide funding for this missing middle housing. So a local government could do that as well to ensure that these conversions don't just, create housing for the most affluent families.
One phenomenon that you point out in Just Action is this internal segregation in mixed income properties, and I wanted to ask you if this is the example that you provide is in New York City. I'm wondering if this is a New York City phenomenon, or have you seen this in other communities? I guess the follow-up to that: how do you prevent the spread of that?
Yeah, the New York City example, the Poor Door example, is that what you're
Yes, yeah,
referring to?
that's what I'm referring
Yeah.
to. Yeah.
So there was a development where the developer built a certain number of market rate units and then subsidized very low income units and made a separate entrance for the affordable units so that the poor people and the rich people didn't even have to interact with each other. That is not allowed in those projects anymore.
Mm,
Many of these government subsidies, for the low income units require that the residents get similar amenities
mhm,
for being in the same development. So that's an important step in creating these programs to finance these mixed income housing developments, is to require that the residents aren't treated differently. There's also, some developers argue that they have to internally segregate the units in order to make the market rate units profitable, that people don't want to live next to poor people even on the same floor.
mhm.
And it's just not true that it's not true that people don't like that. And it's also not true that financially, to get their loans that they need to segregate the units, some developers argue that they have to do that. So this is another way local government, in its powers to regulate how developments are built, could ensure that this doesn't happen. And we give an example of a development in Massachusetts that's funded through a state program that's called the Workforce Housing Program. We also have issues with that word because poor people are also in the workforce, but they intend that program to help finance this missing middle housing. So a developer there coupled a lot of financing sources, to finance the lower income units, the missing middle units, and then some market rate units, all in the same development, and made all of the units identical. So a low income person who moves into a subsidized low income unit, whose income then increases, can then their unit becomes a middle income unit. And then the
Mhm.
next unit that becomes available is a low income unit. So in that way, as people's conditions and situations change, their designation changes. But because
Mhm.
the units are all the same, they could still maintain the same mix of income levels.
Mhm.
And we have a picture in Just Action of a social event that this development does. It was a paint night, and there's, a mix of all kinds of people in this photo. And my dad interviewed some people who live there and asked them to identify in the photo, do you know who in this photo lives in a low income unit or a middle income or a market
Mhm.
rate unit? And they don't know. They don't
Right,
know
sure.
people's finances, they just know them as their neighbors. So that's what it takes to build these truly mixed income developments.
Mhm. You talk a little bit, kind of in a related point, you talk about conscientious gentrification. given the market forces pushing out African American families. When you have these mixed income communities, what do you see as the best way to encourage, say, the kind of projects that you introduced in your initial pages, the map twins, the pastoral communications? How do you promote kind of an integration, if you will, of experiences and views and celebration of community in these new developments?
Yeah, I think it's bringing people together to live near each other. And then once we do, we realize we're not all that different. I think one reason we are so polarized is because we are separate. And so we think we're very different because we have no contact with each other socially to sort of negate those views. And so living in mixed income developments with people of different income levels and different races helps to do that, creating social activities in those kinds of developments. And then in terms of outside of those developments, the map twins and the interracial dialogue you're referring to, it just takes some effort, and it takes people willing and eager to do that, to start to get outside of their bubble and meet other people and start to learn about how their community came to be, how it is, and what they can do to improve it for everybody. So it takes people willing to be involved and just wanting to talk to each other. And the Silicon Valley example again is they just started talking to each other. They went door to door. It didn't take a gimmick or a folded map or anything like that. So it just takes a little extra effort. And the conscientious gentrification example you gave, so we give a lot of the strategies and policies that we outline in Just Action for a community group to take on include those that, like we've been talking about, opening up exclusive white, mostly suburban communities to diverse housing and diverse residents, and then also to increasing the investments and resources in lower income segregated African American communities, where the concentration of poverty is a result of its segregation. So we want to make those areas places of higher opportunity to address the consequences of segregation. And when we do that, when we increase investments and resources in lower income communities, often people with higher incomes want to move in, gentrification happens, the longtime residents are threatened with being priced out. So we reprinted this flyer that a man who lives in a gentrifying community, or who has lived in many gentrifying communities, had circulated to his neighbors, called 5 Ways to Be a Conscientious Gentrifier. Maybe it was 8 ways. Anyway, several ways. And they were all about how to just engage with the community. And, we understand that some gentrification will happen. So some people who haven't lived in those communities, for generations will move in. And to counter what usually happens, which is those people move in but don't interact and don't engage and don't connect with the community that has been there before them, this flyer sort of encourages his neighbors to do that, to attend local churches, send their kids to local schools, get involved with local organizations, be friendly to their neighbors, start to understand what the issues are in the community. And that can help us sort of be less polarized as we're living near each other. And then there's also policy solutions that can prevent some of the displacement that will happen with gentrification, like renter protections against rapidly increasing rents or unjust evictions, legal counsel for tenants facing evictions, inclusionary zoning, like I mentioned before, is another good one. So there's both the personal and then the policy level of ways to address that.
As for additional remedies, I know that the Biden administration has come up with a interagency task force on property appraisal and valuation equity. We are familiar in news cycles of people who have had outrageously low appraisals of African American homeowners, who have realtors come in and give them quotes that are much less what their homes are worth. What the Biden administration has done is basically looking into data that will allow appraisers and consumers and researchers to investigate trends of appraisals in their area to help improve quality and compliance. They've also proposed breaking down barriers of entry into the profession, bumping up diversity and education standards. I was wondering if you could comment in the about 2.5 minutes that we have left on what your view is on these initial steps to remedy some of the problems of that homeowners and people who are seeking home buyers are running into as they navigate these spaces.
Yeah, I think those are all very important reforms. We can't address the problem until we can document it and know what is actually happening. So far, what we know about appraisal bias is only from, anecdotal stories of African American homeowners who get their home appraised and then have a white friend stand in for them and get it reappraised, and they get a lot higher appraised value. But we can't know how widespread that is because that only happens sometimes when someone suspects a low appraisal. So the data collection and reporting so we can see how close appraisals are to their actual sales price will help us know where bias is occurring, and then also help us identify the appraisers that are performing biased appraisals so that we can enforce their commitment to not be biased in their profession. Also, opening up the profession is essential. It's a very white male profession. You can only get into it by through an apprenticeship. So it's sort of passed down by people you know. And so in order to address bias, we also need appraisers who understand the neighborhoods that they're appraising in, which means we need more than just white men in that profession. So I think these are all important advancements towards addressing the issue.
So there's a quote in your book: as a society, we are always more sensitive to unfairness experienced by whites when it's designed to remedy unfairness experienced by Blacks. It would take public education and a vastly intensified public commitment to address segregation before public support for such an action could emerge. And I'm just wondering how you see this developing in the current political moment, which is so fraught that we can't, there are some segments of society, some states that can't grapple with discussions of slavery and the history of slavery, much less segregation and what came later. How do you feel about American society ever being able to truly grapple with these questions?
Well, a few things. I think that we have no choice. We have to grapple with this if we want to live in a truly democratic, fair society. We have to grapple with the unconstitutional actions of our government and remedy those actions. And to do that, we need to grapple with the racial history of our past and present, and we need to take race into account to be able to do that. I think that the fact that some states and localities are, trying to limit how we can talk about this. My dad likes to say that if they're doing that, it means it's because we're talking about it. If we weren't, he likes to tell a story of when he was growing up in New York. He wasn't allowed by his teacher to call the Civil War a civil war. He had to call it the War of states' rights. So the fact that there's pushback against this means that it's because we are talking about it and we are teaching the true history, which I think is a step in the right direction. And, for the states that are trying to go backwards on this, there's many states going forward and talking about reparations programs and repairing some of the harm that has happened in their states. So it's not going to be easy, or I think we'd be naive to think it won't be contentious to do this, but we believe that we have no choice, and we have to do it. And this is the way forward to address those race-specific crimes, we need to be race-specific in our remedies. And there is so much evidence to the ways the government has taken unconstitutional action to create and maintain segregation that there's enough, evidence there for us to base remedies on. And we just have to get started doing it.
Leah Rothstein is the co-author of Just Action. I want to thank you very much for speaking with us today here at the American Prospect.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
All right.